Thank you so much for this invitation and for coming on here and sharing with each other. I appreciate so much this Sabbath School and the discussions that happen here, the comments and the connections that we make. To speak about faith is something that I do in my classrooms with college students who are not necessarily students of the Bible, religion, and our beliefs, but college students who are basically required to take religion courses. So in a class of about 45 students, it is important to speak about faith in what I would like to have a more relevant way to the generation that grows up and is the generation of today's world. And we all recognize that this is a time when so much change takes place in the way we view life and the world that we live in and how we approach these matters. So the story that I'm using from the Bible is in Genesis chapter 15. It's Abraham, where Abraham becomes established as the father of faith, the father of faith religions, the three major religions in the world. It is in this story, in the middle of this story, that we for the first time read in the Bible that he believed. And it was even credited to him or counted to him as righteousness. What a statement. And it is that statement that has brought about a trajectory in the world, in the history of religion, from that ancient text to a prophetic text in the book of Habakkuk, and then even into the New Testament gospel or letter of Paul to the Romans. And then we find it in what we as Seventh-day Adventists also like to see as at the roots of our institution and church of faith, as that statement of righteousness by faith from the time of the Reformation, 1517. And then we will come to the story of Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. So here is how I like to start with that story of chapter 15. Are you able to see the second slide? It moves on, right? So the context of Abraham's time and Abraham's life, it comes to us from the map that you see here on this slide of the third dynasty of Ur in the ancient Near Eastern world that stretches from the Persian Gulf and then goes up to the north along the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. And the influence that this time and history has left on the world. So the king who establishes this kingdom is seen here on a cylinder seal. This is King Ur-Nammu from that third dynasty of Ur. He is the king from whom we have one of the first legal codes, where laws are written, laws that govern and build the system of life, of society on different kinds of levels. Society in terms of family life, life between slaves and their owners, and so on. So there is one of the first systems of law that comes from that time period. This seems to be an important piece because when we come to the biblical story, we will find in the story of Abraham, the making of covenant. And covenant from that ancient Near Eastern time is built on a system of legal documents and an establishment that functions on the basis of laws. So I now have a little trouble here as well. Where does it move forward?
You might want to click on your, there you go.
Yes, there it is. So to now have a little more context on Abraham himself, who comes out of that kind of world. In the biblical story, we have an interesting timeline of his life. So for example, when Abraham is called to leave his father's house and his family, that father, Terah, has already moved towards the north in the Mesopotamian region of Haran, and Abraham is 75 years old when he is called to leave from that place and then to go to a land that God says, I will show you. Basically, there is no statement where Abraham is to go. There is no direction. Abraham is left in limbo and where to go. So he starts his journey. He leaves from that place, and then he will enter into the region of Canaan in that age of 75. We read about him that he travels around in this place. He even goes to Egypt because there is a famine in the land. At some point, he is waiting for the fulfillment of that promise to have children. And we all know the story. Abraham and Sarah go ahead and bring that about by themselves. They force Hagar to be that first mother of a child, and Ishmael is born when Abraham is about 85. Finally, Isaac will be born, and Abraham is 100 years old. When Sarah dies, he is 137. And then when Isaac marries Rebekah, the Bible states he's 140, and when he dies, he's 175. Those are the specific references in Genesis between chapter 12 and chapter 25, where we have that cycle of Abraham's story in the biblical text. And that kind of storytelling is, it took me to the past slides a bit here. So I introduced to you the region where Abraham came from in Ur in Chaldea, and now we come to the cycle of the storytelling. So here the Bible gives that to us in a very organized manner. And so we should never think that the biblical writer on these stories goes about just by, putting in there whatever like comes to him. That is not the case. The biblical writer has a well-organized manuscript that is put in place here. And now if we speak of the biblical writer or how the story comes to us afterwards, when it is read and remade again into a very clear, structured narrative. So we start out at the end of chapter 11 with Abraham's call, and then the promise that everything that he will leave behind will be restored and will be given to him again. So leave Abraham, go and leave is that first word that God calls onto him. And then I will give you, and you will be a blessing, and all of those promises at the beginning of chapter 12. Abraham leaves and he takes that sojourn to Canaan. He travels around there. He goes to Egypt because of the famine in Canaan. And we know the story when he denies his wife, Sarai. All of these pieces are mirrored when you go from A to A prime, or yes, at the bottom of this slide, from B to B prime. There is another sojourn in Gerar. When he goes to Egypt in C1, he goes to Gerar as well and denies Sarah for a second time. So there is the mirroring of Abraham's life from the beginning to the end. And it seems that this kind of life of that patriarch that we so admire in all the three established religions of monotheistic religions of faith, that this life of Abraham is actually a life that is not so very different. I mean, the beginning from the end. There is not so much huge change happening. Otherwise, why would he not recognize his failure against his wife, for example, and then do that again towards the end? There is the separation from Lot that takes place in C2, and it is mirrored also in C2 by the separation that Abraham acts on when he sends off Hagar and Ishmael, for example. So that son that he loves as well, not only the one that comes afterwards. There is the covenant that begins and it becomes to be established in chapter 15. This is the chapter that we will focus on today. But then that covenant part receives so much emphasis in E to E prime, in F and F prime, and then in the very center of this chiastic structure. So the middle part of this chiastic structure is where the narrative wants to provide the flow towards, and then from that middle section, it takes us out again towards the end of Abraham's life in the narrative. And yet that covenant that is established between God and Abraham, with all its parts that are important in it, the statement of he believed, with the statement that Abraham is considered a friend of God and that he follows God's will and God's laws and decrees and so on. And yet, in spite of that, Abraham is still a very human being when we come to see him, how he acts towards the end. So to come now closer to that covenant aspect in the story, let's take a further look in there. Let's see. So these slides, I don't like how they work at this time. Here is the covenant. The covenant starts in Genesis chapter 15, but this covenant has a context. And the context is given in detail from chapter 14 and then drives us into chapter 15. So when we come to see the covenant in chapter 15, we like to pay attention to the end of that strange way of covenant making, where Abraham is in a vision and he is in the dark and he is asked to kill some animals and then lay them out in two separate rows facing each other. So he is to choose a heifer and then cut it in half and lay those pieces across each other. There is also a female goat that he's to do the same, a ram, and then a turtle dove and a pigeon. Now, this is a very different kind of law about sacrifices than we find usually in the book of Leviticus, when we deal with the sacrifices and the animals and how they should be prepared. So this one is kind of unique in the Bible, if you will. It has only maybe one or so other links to it in the biblical text, and also not very much evidence from the historical ancient Near Eastern world to it. There is some that we are able to see. So all these animals are to be cut in half, and then a covenant is cut according to the Hebrew language. So that cutting of the covenant, at least from the point of view and from the language, seems to relate well with this kind of ritual that takes place in this chapter 15. And so that language of covenant making in the Bible is retained in many parts of the biblical text. A covenant is often not only made, it is cut. And even in our English language, we keep that kind of, if you will, that kind of like force of the language of the word. It is a covenant. Is like we cut a deal, we strike a bargain. That is forceful and strong language that we use, and it seems that it has its origin or its roots in these kind of ancient Near Eastern rituals that were apparently used and were known. And so we find them in the biblical story as well. So one, just to give a little bit of a context to that strange ritual, comes from in the ancient Near Eastern text, comes from a small piece of limestone. This is a discovered amulet that is dated to the 7th century BC. It's discovered in today's Syria, and it has an inscription on it. And on that inscription, it reads, as this calf is cut up or cut in half. So thus Mati-Ilu, who is a leader, a noble, and his nobles shall be cut. So when a ruler of the ancient world cut a deal, made a covenant with somebody else, this kind of ritual seems to have been taken place, and that could be seen as a connection to what the biblical story and the covenant making ritual of Genesis 15 could connect to in the text. There is one single passage in the book of Jeremiah where this kind of ritual seems to be alluded to as well. And it is when Jeremiah is a prophet in the time of the last king of Judah, King Zedekiah. And there is this passage in chapter 34 where we also read that the one who makes a covenant and then does not follow through on his obligations is supposed to be cut in half, like the animals that are cut in half and then set apart from each other. So that gives, and this part of Genesis 15 has been studied and come down to this understanding. And so in the Christian interpretation of this passage here, we come to see here a cutting of the covenant in a symbolic way of these animals. And then there is a fiery torch that Abraham sees passing through in between those pieces. Now that fiery torch is not explained in the text. It is also, it is left basically standing by itself. And so the only possibility to discuss it and to see a connection to it is when we continue reading about God or the deity who is symbolized through fire in several other parts in the Hebrew Bible. So, for example, the fiery, the bush who burns and doesn't burn down when Moses stands in front of it. We have also the cloud of God that appears in the desert to the people of Israel in the book of Exodus. During the day, it is a cloud. In the night, it is fire. It is also then seen on top of the tabernacle and recognized as God's presence with the people of Israel during the 40 years in the desert. So God is with them, present, visible by this fire, through this fiery cloud. Similar texts happen throughout later texts also, where God is symbolized or in this with this like a fire or like a huge fire burning and so on. So then in the New Testament, based on all of these passages together, the New Testament understanding then comes down to see here God passing through himself, through those pieces of animals, taking upon himself the responsibility to fulfill that covenant and going as far as giving up his life to being killed. And in the New Testament, the death of Jesus is seen here as that fulfillment, ultimate fulfillment of that torch of fire that takes on the covenant to the ultimate point. Now, the first part of Genesis 15 needs to be found in chapter 14, because there is the transition from chapter 14 to 15 in the first verses. So what happens in Genesis chapter 14? Just a bit of a reminder, in that chapter, Abraham is on a military campaign. His nephew Lot had separated from him. And there are some kings that come from the region where Abraham's family has its origin in the land of Shinar and Elam, which is on the Persian Gulf, the region of ancient Ur and those kings that rule there. So those kings have had their time to rule over kings in the northern part of Canaan, and also going down into the Canaan regions. So those kings have ruled for, I believe, about 13 years, and they took tribute from the people in Canaan. And now several of the Canaanite smaller kings gather and build a coalition to fight off this superpower from across the Arabian desert. And so the 5 kings who are more powerful and try to keep their power come with their soldiers across and to fight against the kings in Canaan. During that time, they enter and they take over and they defeat the Canaanite kings, and they take with them also Lot, who had set himself up in the region of Sodom. And Abraham, who lives more to the south in the desert, in a very harsh land, he hears about this and he gathers his own soldiers. According to Genesis 14, he has, I believe, 340 soldier trained men, it says, and he goes up to fight against those kings that took Lot and his family and all kinds of other people and a lot of goods and spoils with them. So he goes and after them, and he fights them, and seems to, according to the story, he defeats them. He is able to get Lot back and his family and bring back a lot of the goods and other people that were taken captive. On his way back, he passes through a place called Salem, and he meets Melchizedek, the famous righteous king, who later in the Bible becomes known as the king of Salem. And in the biblical stories, this is going to be Jerusalem, the city of peace, isn't it? Melchizedek is said to be the king, the king of the Most High God and a righteous king. He comes out to greet Abraham, and Abraham offers him tithe. The first time in the Bible that we read about that, and in our own way of understanding this, we go back to this story about tithe, with our way of doing tithe in our church. So a lot of things go back to this old story in Genesis 14 and 15. So there, Abraham comes out as the hero. He is the victor. He has brought back the goods. He's brought back his own nephew, and now everybody is like greeting him and is happy that all of that happened. And yet, when we now come to chapter 15, Abraham sits in his tent and he looks out, and I'm going to skip this a bit and take the text first about those first verses to you in Genesis chapter 15. So here is the text. Let me make it a little bigger for you and to read easier. So here is that text. After these things, so after those things that happened according to chapter 14, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision. So I believe it's important to keep that in mind. It comes in a vision. And God says, do not fear, Abraham. I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great. Every time when I read this promise here, this verse, I think, wouldn't it have been nicer of God if he had said this to Abraham before he went to fight against those kings, so that he would have some assurance and would not need probably to fear and not need to feel without protection and needed to have to set up his own protection. I am a shield to you, says God. A shield like you use when you go to fight in the army. I am also a reward, and your reward shall be very great, he says. Well, Abraham received a lot of reward when he came back from that campaign, from that battle, and yet he kept none of it. He gave it all up. He gave it back to the people to whom it belonged. And now God comes with this promise. It's almost like after the event. Why is that? What is going on here? And so Abraham has a response. And this is, by the way, the first time in the story of Abraham, which starts in chapter 12, when God speaks to him, when God calls him to go out, and Abraham does, and he does go out. He follows everything without anything to say in return. Here, finally, this for the first time that Abraham has words for God. And he goes, "Oh Lord God." This introduction, this phrase seems to like set the tone. Now we can read that, of course, in a manner that could be seen as very reverent. But pay attention how it continues, and that is when I see it as not in such a submissive way, not at all. Why? Because Abraham is here already in his 80s, 85. And that promise that was given to him 10 years ago, nothing of it came true. Actually, the very opposite happened. Abraham said to leave your father's house, go, and I will give you. And the first thing when he enters Canaan is a famine. The next thing is he goes to Egypt. He's scared that he is going to be killed. And he acts on that fear, and he gives up Sarah, his own wife. So nothing of the promise comes through, not the promise of children, of descendants, not the promise of a great career, a great future, a lot of land and property, nothing. So here he sits in his tent all by himself alone in the vision, and he says, oh Lord God, what do you give me? I am childless. You can read that. I am still childless. And the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. The city of Damascus up there in Syria, where Abraham passed through, possibly on his way when he came to enter into Canaan about 10 years ago. Or even now when he went up to fight against those kings also. So there is the person that he has taken to be his servant. And now that's the only one he can trust. That's the only one he can leave what he owns. And Abraham says, since you have given me no offspring, no child, one born in my house is my heir. So Eliezer is this one. And then the word of the Lord came to him again and says, this man will not be your heir, but one who will come forth from your own body, and he shall be your heir. So up to here in this, at the end of verse 4, there is the promise again about the descendants. And nothing happened so far. After this, we read, according to the narrative here, that he, in reference to God, apparently, even though it's not directly stated, took him outside and said, now look toward the heavens, count the stars, if you are able to count them. This kind of promise, we have gotten used to this kind of promise. I will make you as numerous as the stars. I will make you like the sand of the seashore. Those kind of promises are given to Abraham in different places in the book of Genesis. But pay attention to that little if that follows in that promise. If you are able to count them. So then the biblical writer in verse 6 makes if you will, a commentary, puts in a statement in here about Abraham. And he says, then he believed in the Lord. So he is understood as Abraham, and he believed in the Lord. And then again, he reckoned it to him as righteousness. This second he that we have here is not as clear, not even as clear as the first one. So translators and commentators have every right to argue about that. Is this he, the Lord, or is it he, Abraham? Oh, there are all kinds of possibilities about that. And the ancient rabbis have argued about this text for many, many years, from BC times. And there are the different perspectives on this passage here. Now, in the Christian world, we like to see this as Abraham is the one who believes in the Lord, and the Lord is the one who counts it or reckons that to him as righteousness. So let's continue to the next part. And he said to him in verse 7, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land. So the next promise is stated here again. I give you this land to possess it. And yet Abraham sits there and has no land. Actually, throughout his entire life, he will not own a piece of land. He will even have to, his wife, basically, by the way, his wife, Sarah, dies when he's 145 years old, remember that? And he has to go and buy a cave in order to bury her. He has no land his entire lifetime. So I give you this land to possess it. So don't you think that Abraham has again every right to go, oh Lord God, how do I know that I will possess it? So those kind of questions that Abraham puts out here are questions that for the first time in his relationship with God, according to these narratives, he actually expresses something. He actually talks back to God and asks questions and wants to know, because things are so uncertain. And after that, then we read, so, okay, bring me that 3-year-old heifer and a female goat and the turtle dove and the pigeon and the ram and so on. And then that ritual happens after all of this. So here is our text. And he took him outside and said, now look toward the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. And then he believed in the Lord. That word to believe that is stated there in Hebrew is a word that is used to, and it is translated as to believe, to have faith, to trust, and so on. It is in this passage here in the book of Isaiah that we have a reference about this word that is a lot more, if you will, tangible, even though it's in metaphor, it's in poetry language. And yet we learn here that to believe is like when you put a peg firmly into the ground. Like when you set up your tent and you have to like make it strong, make it firm, so the wind doesn't blow it and it doesn't fall down. So you use a peg and you put that firmly into the ground, and that is what that Hebrew language has in its root meaning in there. Firmly stable, a trustworthy thing has happened there when you do that with your tent. Is that possible? In the middle of total and complete uncertainty, in the middle of, so what do you actually give me? Because there is no heir, there is no child. And then afterwards, so how do I know? And yet right there in the center is he believed, he trusted. And that was credited to him as righteousness. To look at this story of Abraham in that structure from the beginning to the end, I come to see something that strikes me as really interesting, in the sense of, you see, we like to put Abraham out there as this great man who has faith in God, who is not struggling, who is going up that mountain, even with his son Isaac in chapter 22, and he is willing to offer him up as a sacrifice to God. And yet, he believed, was not sad about Abraham up on that Mount of Moriah. That is not when Abraham received this kind of like affirmation as a person of faith. But it is when he is in the middle of uncertainty, in the middle of questioning, in the middle of even kind of like expressing it in such a way that you can see him, how he gets like all raged up against God. Nothing has happened, God, that you gave me. You promised it 10 years ago, and nothing came through. So I like to see ourselves right there in the middle of the story. Can we see ourselves there after having prayed maybe for any kind of thing that is an important thing to us to pray about, and we pray to God for 5 years, for 10 years, for 20 years, and we are still left wondering, is it possible that right there in between, throughout all those years, we can also claim he believed, I believed in the Lord? How does that work? What is that kind of faith that is possible in the middle of a non-answered prayer? I have two children. When they were little and I came home through the door and they were in the house, I remember several times that both of them would come running. Mom, she did this, he did that, she did that. And so I stood there and had to find out what was going on. And so I had to listen to the stories, and the stories were often very confusing, blaming one of the other, and then find a way of, like, bringing some kind of a resolution, some kind of a peace into the house. And I found it interesting that it was always in those kind of moments when my children were able to express themselves to me in the most, in the strongest way, in the way when they had no fear about what I would say, and they were able to say yes, but, and I would argue with them, and they would come back and argue back. And this kind of argument took us through sometimes lengthy struggles with each other. And yet it was in the middle of those struggles when I realized that is when I really get to know what it is all about, what they are all about, who they are, what they are thinking, what their desires are, their deepest thoughts are. And it is in those times when that is possible that we are closest with each other. When we are able to say, oh Lord God, why? How? How can this be? When there is no hesitancy, when there is no like a certain kind of like wall set up, but when we are able to say it all, express it all, give it all. That is what I believe is truly to believe, because it is the relationship that is here in the forefront. You don't believe that there is a God, but you believe, you are firm that you can say it all out loud, no matter what that God or who that God is or who you think the God is. You can express yourself from your deep down, from your core being. And that is what I see happening here in the story of Abraham. So Abraham Heschel, who I cited last time when I was with you also, puts it this way: we are closer to God when we are asking questions than when we think we have the answers. We do not have all the answers. We do not have even enough answers to explain such texts as those rituals that we read about in the Bible in Genesis 15. We do not know much actually about the life and the person of Abraham, if you will. We have just snippets put into a very structured story and narrative in the Bible, snippets that come from his life. And so faith is born not in the answer, but in the question, not in the harmony where we have to make everything fit together, but in dissonance. And this is Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the chief rabbi of London, who passed away not too long ago. So is it possible that this man, Abraham, when he was taken out to count the stars, if you are able to count them, that little if has something to say even to us? And I think that biblical narrative in chapter 15 gives even 2 more hints to it to help us think further actually about what it means to believe. If you are able, and now pay attention, count the stars. When do we usually think we are able to count stars? Or at least we try to count stars. The sky should be dark, isn't it, in order to see some stars. And again, as a child, I remember looking up and trying to like build a square on the sky with my eyes, and then trying to count the stars that I would be able to see at least within that square. And the longer I looked, the more I realized I don't get them all. I cannot count them. So what does the biblical text here in Genesis 15 give us? If you take a few verses further into the text, here is what you read. Now, when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abraham, and a great terror came, and darkness, and so on. What is the biblical writer doing with us, readers? He does it one more time in verse 17. He says, it came about when the sun had set that it was very dark. And that is then finally when that smoking oven and the flame of the flaming torch appear and pass between the pieces. So it is not necessarily to me at this point about the animals and the flaming torch, but it is about the stars and the sun. We often give this interpretation. We think Abraham is taken out of his tent and he's to look up into a dark sky, into a night sky, and supposed to count stars, and is told, as numerous as those stars are, that sky that you see up there, so shall your descendants be. But then the biblical writer plays a game with us, if you will. He says, now when the sun was going down, and then one more time when the sun had set. So there was no dark night sky, if you will, in that sense. Or we would have to go ahead of this biblical writer and say, well, there might be a day have passed and so on. But that is not what the story wants to convey. The story wants to ask us to recognize, if you are able to count them. And that little if stands in the way of often what we think we should have faith or some kind of a proof of it. And nothing in this story talks about that kind of faith that should be there without any proof, or a faith that is just blind without anything. No, Abraham was not blind and was not asked to be blind. He was able to see the sun going down. He was able to see the sunset. And so in the biblical world, in the world of spiritual beings, in the world of a God who comes to us through miracles, the only thing that we are able to recognize is to stand amazed in front of anything that we see out there. If it is the stars or the sun, or even that kind of promise that has not come true at all throughout all of our lives. At the end of his life, Heschel wrote this conclusion. He gave it in an interview towards the end, and was able to say, never once in my life did I ask God for success or wisdom or fame. I asked for wonder, and he gave it to me. So is it possible that that is something that is more important than those questions that need to be answered today in a classroom, but rather something that keeps us going? Because again, according to this author, the surest way to suppress our ability and to understand God, to make sense, and so on, is the importance of worship, is to not take things for granted, because it's this indifference to the sublime that is at the root of sin. And wonder or radical amazement, those are the chief characteristics of the religious person. And they are not only towards religion and God, but as well toward the events in history, toward nature, toward the things that we see as tangible elements of our life. And that is in a classroom full of students who study science. It is more important to recognize that wonder, even in the world of scientific research, to stand amazed in front of things that happen, and that then finally, through a lot of work, we are able to get a glimpse of, maybe a small one at the beginning. And then it grows because it is that work that is put in there by human beings who try to understand, that to disclose something more about life, which is still so amazing. So at the end, faith is not the clinging to a shrine. It is not a set of beliefs. It is not a church building. It is not a church, but it is the pilgrimage that we each take and go, the pilgrimage of hearts. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you were a pastor for much of your life, and I was a pastor for my entire life. And I'm thinking, as you're describing Abraham's faith and this sort of wrestling, conflicted, I've got to be arguing with you before I can have a relationship with you, sort of thing. When I was young, I started out with a faith that was kind of childish or adolescent, perhaps. That if I did all the right things, I ate the right foods and went to church on Sabbath and everything, God would love me and save me. As a college student, I learned a sort of righteousness by faith. I'm not sure it was a very deep righteousness by faith, but it was certainly a sense of that God could save me, even though I was struggling with various sins and wasn't perfect. Throughout my ministry, I think I tried to convey maybe that sense of righteousness by faith quite a lot. I tried to tell people that they could have assurance of salvation, which seemed to me sort of a minimum thing that we ought to be able to expect of God, that we don't have to always be unsure. Uh, but now I'm hearing from you something that is kind of goes back again to it sounds like there's a lot of that we end our lives with this kind of faith in a lot of doubt, perhaps a lot of unsureness, um, and it's not where I wanted to end. I wanted to end my life having perfect assurance and no questions, and know that I was saved, and lay on my deathbed and say, "Oh, Jesus is taking care of it. I have no question whatsoever." Uh, and now I'm not sure. Do you understand what I'm saying, Dr. Frey?
Probably you have met and accompanied a lot more people on this journey than I have, also toward more toward the end of their lives. Yes, there is surely it is beautiful if we can come to that conclusion. I think so. And at the same time, that strong way of saying is still something that we have, that we do, and I'm not sure if that is really deep down the case, that happens deep inside, or it is something that we have learned about and learned to say and to do.
I have met one person in my life, only one, who lay on his deathbed and said, "I have not the slightest doubt. I'm perfectly happy to die within the next hour," and he did. But he was absolutely cheerful about it. He's the only one, Dr. Frey, that I've ever met. Most people, most of us on our deathbeds, I think, at least the people I have visited, are still have some unsureness about it. And I find at this time in my life, I'm there with Abraham asking these questions, still wrestling, fighting with God after a whole lifetime of being a pastor. I'm just trying to open up the conversation here, so I'm being kind of bluntly honest. But and I suspect a lot of the people here on here today would say, "Yeah, I so much want to have this assurance relationship, blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine." And yeah,
Let
I'm
me
not
add,
sure that we have that.
yeah, let me add one point that I did not touch on. And one way of reading these Abraham stories, especially from the ancient rabbis' perspectives also, is to see something here in the life of this man where it is actually God who has faith in Abraham.
Mhm.
And God is the one who goes with him, no matter what Abraham does. If he denies Sarah or not, if he goes against the actual, will, and then takes Hagar and has a child with Hagar, sends those people off, and so on. It is rather the journey that God takes with Abraham into this land of the unknown, and kind of like, let's go together in a way. maybe that is something what I see then as the Christ way, God who comes down to us and not asks us to get up to him.
But it is clearly not a comfortable, easy little story. Abraham does have some promises fulfilled, but it never comes easy for him.
Mm-hmm.
This question of what shape faith takes in our lives is a really important one, and I hope others will join in here because this is probably right at the focused heart of our faith. What should our lives be like